to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews.
Today we read from Joshua chapter 14. These are the inheritances that the people of Israel received in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the fathers' houses of the tribes of the people of Israel, gave them to inherit. Their inheritance was by lot, just as Yahweh had commanded by the hand of Moses, for the 9 1/2 tribes. For Moses had given an inheritance to the 2 1/2 tribes beyond the Jordan, but to the Levites he gave no inheritance among them. For the people of Joseph were 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, and no portion was given to the Levites in the land, but only cities to dwell in, with their pasture lands for their livestock and their substance. The people of Israel did as Yahweh commanded Moses. They allotted the land. Then the people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, "You know what Yahweh said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses the servant of Yahweh sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, yet I wholly followed Yahweh my God. And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed Yahweh my God. And now behold, Yahweh has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years, since the time that Yahweh spoke this word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now behold, I am this day 85 years old. I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country of which Yahweh spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. It may be that Yahweh will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as Yahweh said." Then Joshua blessed him, and he gave Hebron to Caleb the son of Jephunneh for an inheritance. Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite to this day, because he wholly followed Yahweh the God of Israel. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim, and the land had rest from war. This is the word of the Lord. So as we look at today's text, we're going to start seeing the inheritance given to the Israelites on the western side of the Jordan River. The east side is already covered, right? That was chapter 13, as we talked about with the 2 1/2 tribes. So this has been instructed by God long before. I mean, this goes back to Numbers chapter 26, verse 56, or chapter 33, verse 54. God's promise that he's going to bring them into the promised land, and that when he does, they will divide up that land. The Lord will give it to them. And the process of how that's going to happen here, we learn, is by lot. In other words, the priest will take the Urim and the Thummim, the special stones that are contained within his breastplate that he wears as the high priest, and they will roll those stones or throw those stones. They cast them, I guess is the word usually used in the text. They cast lots, right? And how those stones fall is going to indicate the various portions of land given to each of the different groups of people, each tribe, and within each tribe, and that gets more specific going down from there as they divide up the land. So we don't know exactly what that will look like. We don't have a clear depiction in Scripture of what the Urim and the Thummim even looked like. But as they cast these stones, the Lord guided these stones in order to show the people his will, and in this case, his gift to them. Right? He's dividing up this land among 9 1/2 tribes of Israel, so that they may have the gift that he wished to give to them. So, as we look at that then, the reminder here, 2 1/2 tribes on the east of the Jordan, the Levites don't get an inheritance. Their inheritance is the Lord, as we saw in chapter 13 yesterday, that we will see in verse 4 here, that they will have cities, and those cities will have pasture lands and livestock, and that the Lord will use that to provide some subsistence for his people, his priests, his Levites. So you have the tribe of Levi, so you have 12 tribes. taking the inheritance away from Levi in that sense, of the inheritance of land, brings that down to 11. So to get back to 12, Joseph's tribe is split into two. So instead of having Joseph as one of the 12, you have his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So minus Levi, minus Joseph, but plus Ephraim, plus Manasseh. You're back to 12. And again, half of Manasseh has already settled on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So it's among these remaining 9.5 tribes that the land will be divided. But before we get into that idea, which will start coming into the text tomorrow, we have a specific allotment, a specific inheritance that is spelled out for us today, and it would be for one of the two men that has seen it all. This is an account that if your children can, let them tell you, right? Let them think back to the 12 spies who Moses sent to spy out the promised land. That's one that a lot of children know. It seems to be a familiar Sunday school text. So see if they can recall that. If not, go back and I believe it's Numbers chapter 13. Give that a read together so that you can see this and what's going on here. Numbers 13 and probably 14 as well gets into the outcomes of that event. So the basics is Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, up to the promised land to spy out the land. What do the people look like? How big are their defenses, their fortifications? What kind of food is there? Bring back some of the food if you can. Those are the sort of things that they're to do. Joshua and Caleb are two of the spies, and they bring back a favorable report. But the other 10 spies that they went with bring back a negative report. They cause fear and panic among the people to the point where the people in Numbers 14 try to kill Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb. They try to stone them all to death so that they can then pick a new leader for themselves and go back to Egypt. And it is only because Yahweh himself directly intervenes in that moment in Numbers 14 that doesn't happen. That's how rebellious we sinners are by our nature, so despising that they were of God's gift. They did not trust that, as Yahweh said, he would drive the enemies from the land. They didn't trust that he would. They feared what they called giants, in a sense. I don't believe they used that word. They did talk about the size of the peoples and how they would be like grasshoppers to them, just small. And that's where this Anakim word is going to come in this section that we have today. We actually had that a couple chapters ago as well. It was tacked on at the end of the conquest that Joshua also defeated the Anakim. And many translators will then combine those passages to take the Anakim as the giants. Perhaps what then results as we see that the Anakim were left in the land of the Philistines. Perhaps that is why the giant Goliath will be part of our conversation in 300 years as you get to the time of before he's king, but the time of King David. So that's what we're looking at here. And we've got some things to maybe mention on our end today, and that would be that Caleb is identified here as the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite. Now, Numbers 13, verse 6 specifically locates Jephunneh and Caleb then coming from the tribe of Judah. It's interesting to see this, though, because the Kenizzite word, the Kenizzites are one of the tribes listed by God in Genesis chapter 15 when he tells Abraham of all the peoples that are living in the land that he's going to remove from the land in order to give it to Abraham. So it's interesting that one of Abraham's grandchildren, Judah, great-grandchildren, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12. So one of Abraham's great-grandchildren is going to ultimately become the one who gives birth to, whose descendants give us the tribe of not just Judah, but they break off, right? They're filling the earth. And so the Kenizzites eventually come from Judah's line, and they live in the land of Canaan that is going to be taken and given to the Israelites. Just interesting to note that God is speaking that then beforehand in Genesis 15:19 by listing the Kenizzites as one of those tribes. The Kenizzites didn't exist yet at that point. Anyway, they don't appear to be very large because that's never mentioned again. The only other time the word Kenizzite appears in Scripture after Genesis 15 is always in connection here to Caleb. I think it only shows up 3 more times. So, Caleb is speaking to Joshua, and he reminds Joshua of this whole thing from Numbers 13 and 14 of their spying out the land and what God had said to Moses at that time, right? And that's not even mentioned here, but it's Numbers chapter 14, verse 24 and verse 30, that no one else was going to get to see the promised land because of their lack of faith, because of their sin against God and their constant grumbling, except for Joshua and Caleb, because they had been faithful in that moment, that they had trusted that God would do what God had said God would do for them. And so Joshua and Caleb are the exceptions. They're going to get to come into the promised land, and they have. But then he's going to note for us, right, and that's down in verse 9, that Moses swore on that day, additionally so, that the place where Caleb's foot has trodden will be an inheritance for him and his children. You can find a verse like that in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 36. Now, it says your children forever. That is conditional still. As we've seen with the Old Testament laws of the Lord, and even with this promise as they go into the promised land, the Lord promises to give it to them and that they will live there forever as long as they obey his commandments, as long as they follow him instead of the pagan gods. If they follow the pagan gods, if they refuse to follow the 10 Commandments, then God will eventually remove them from the land, just as he's removing the people that live there at the moment, because they also refuse to follow the 10 Commandments and to follow the will of God. So it will be the same to them, to the Israelites, as it was to the tribes that have been just now removed. So this is true also for Caleb's descendants after him. But this has for now been given to him because he followed Yahweh. Then we have in verse 10 the reference that it's been 45 years since that moment of the spying out of the land. The Lutheran Study Bible here is going to play with some numbers to try and figure out, okay, exactly when does all this stuff happen? And they look at him in verse 7 saying he's 40 years old, and then they see him in verse 10 being 85 years old. So he's 40 when he's sent into the promised land as a spy. He's 85 at this point where we're talking now. So 45 years have gone by. Then they look at the idea that in Numbers chapter 9, for example, it shows up more than once, the idea that it's the second year that they're sent as spies into the promised land. So the remaining 40 years of wilderness wandering would be 38 years. That is what gives the Lutheran Study Bible the position then that it's been 7 years of fighting here in the book of Joshua to take the promised land from the various Canaanite tribes. Now, I don't know that that's entirely fair, because when you actually read Numbers chapter 9, it does not say that it's been 2 years out of the 40. Instead, it actually says it's the first month of the second year. There's a similar reference elsewhere that says it's the second month of the second year. So I wouldn't say that we can necessarily say that there were 38 years left when Caleb had spied out the land. 39 is a little bit more likely because, again, first or the second month of that second year. A whole year has gone by, but not 2 whole years. That would then mean 39 years of wilderness wandering remaining, and that it's taken 6 years to drive out the Canaanite tribes. The other thing that could be considered, though, and this would throw a wrinkle into things a little bit, but in Numbers 14, that the Lord tells them after they have sinned against him, after they've given the false report, after they have failed to trust the Lord in all these things, that just as it took the 40 days to spy out the promised land, so they would wander the wilderness for 40 years. When does the 40-year clock start? Our general understanding of that as Christians in the history of the church has been that when God said that in Numbers chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, that he was including in the 40 already that a little more than 1 year that they had already been out of Egypt for. So it would be 40 years in total that they would be in that. So again, sounds like maybe 6 years here, but the point is, Caleb at this time, 85 years old. And he says his strength is the same as the day he was sent as a spy. How many 85-year-olds today would be glad to have the same amount of strength at 85 that they had when they were 40? I mean, that's impressive, right? But what's going on here is Caleb himself is going to indicate, right, is that this is the Lord's doing, not his. Verse 10, Yahweh has kept me alive, just as he said. God has kept his promise. Not only did Caleb get to see the promised land, but Caleb gets to inherit in the promised land, as God has told him that he would. And the Lord is faithful to his promises. And so even at 85 years old, facing the idea of going up against the Anakim, the giants, Caleb is not going to back down. Because as he did when he was 40, he trusts that Yahweh is the one who's going to fight for him. And Yahweh does. So we see that in the concluding paragraph here, that he gets that land. He gets the city of, he gets Hebron. He gets the city that was formerly known as Kiriath Arba. Kiriath, Hebrew for city. Arba, as we're told by Joshua there, by the book of Joshua, that Arba was the greatest among the Anakim. So this was a city named after him. That's the city Caleb gets, because God fights for his people. God drives them out. This is something that we can then consider for ourselves today. The Lord's faithfulness, that the Lord keeps his promise, that the Lord is the one who fights for us. And so even though the devil may seem intimidating, even though the devil physically has more strength and power than I do, I don't need to fear the devil, because it is the Lord who fights for me, and it is the Lord who has already conquered the devil and all his plots of evil against the church. And so we can rest assured, knowing that God will keep his promise, knowing that you are safe in the palm of his hand, knowing that the promised land of paradise yet awaits us. Amen.